They burned my barn to the ground on a Sunday morning while I was at church blessing the harvest, and by Monday, Karen was on my porch holding a latte and a contract, acting like she was doing me a favor. That was the moment I realized they didn't just want my land. They wanted to erase everything I built on it. My name, my legacy, my goats, and the blood I'd poured into this place. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just smiled, offered her a seat, and made her think I was about to fold. That was the last time she ever underestimated me. It all started months before the fire when our sleepy little town got an unwanted facelift. What used to be farmland and gravel roads suddenly turned into tidy cul-de-sacs, pastel fences, and suspiciously identical mailboxes. The new HOA moved in like termites with clipboards. They called it community development. I called it a hostile takeover with better landscaping. My land sat at the edge of all that menaced 10 acres of pasture, a bright red barn older than most of the board members, and my goats who had more sense than the entire HOA combined. I'd inherited the land from my granddad, who always said, "Never sell the soul of your family just because someone waves a check." I intended to honor that. Karen, the HOA president, made her first appearance wearing oversized sunglasses, a lemon yellow pantsuit, and a grimace that looked like she smelled manure just by existing. She introduced herself with all the charm of a debt collector and handed me a manila envelope. Inside was an offer, lowball, obviously, with a thinly veiled threat about upcoming zoning changes that might make my life more complicated. I told her my land wasn't for sale and that the goats had more manners than she did. She didn't laugh. The fines started trickling in a week later, one for having a non-uniform fence, another for excessive animal noise, then a $500 fine for unapproved exterior paint colors. My barn was red, always had been. Karen showed up during feeding time once, pointing her iPad at my goats like they were some kind of legal violation. I told her if she got any closer, Buster might chew off her clipboard. Buster bleated in support. By the time the third offer came, the number had gone up, but the threats were more obvious. She hinted at a fire hazard my old barn might pose. That got my attention. I walked her back to the fence, locked it behind her, and told her politely not to step foot on my land again without a proper invitation or a good reason. Then came the fire. It happened just before dawn. I was at church with a few neighbors when my phone buzzed. I thought it was the usual flood of robocalls until I saw the security app notification. Smoke detected. I ran out mid-sermon. By the time I got there, the fire department had already done what they could, but the barn was gone. Ashes, embers, my tools, my feed, the birthing stall I'd built with my own hands. The barn doors had collapsed inward, twisted like scorched ribs. A few of my goats were bleeding, scared but safe, huddled on the far side of the field. I found one of Karen's HOA violation slips floating in a puddle near the remains. It was for unsightly debris on agricultural structures. I laughed so hard I almost cried. Karen had the audacity to show up that afternoon. She wore black, like she was attending a funeral. She even brought a bouquet of store-bought lilies and said something about how tragedy often opens doors to opportunity. She handed me another offer, higher this time. Her smile was tight, like she already thought she'd won. I didn't say a word. I just nodded, told her I'd think about it, and shut the door. That night, I installed every security camera I could afford, roof corners, fence posts, hidden trail cams. I buried some in birdhouses. I wasn't going to let them catch me off guard again. But I wasn't just thinking defense. I was thinking offense. Karen had poked the bear. Now the bear had internet access and legal advice. I started asking around. Turns out the HOA had stretched itself thin buying up lots, promising amenities that didn't exist, and ignoring back taxes on their so-called common areas. Their HOA building sat on a weirdly titled parcel of land with ownership held by a shell company that no one on the board seemed to understand. But I knew someone who did. My friend Jackson, a retired real estate developer who owed me a favor after I saved his vintage truck from rolling into a ditch 2 winters ago. Jackson helped me dig. We found that the HOA was about 3 months from losing its meeting lot to a county auction due to unpaid taxes. Nobody had noticed. Karen certainly hadn't. She was too busy redesigning the HOA website and planning her next attempt at bullying me into selling. I printed out the auction notice and pinned it inside my new tool shed, right next to a photo of my granddad holding a goat and flipping off the camera. Every morning after that, I fed the goats, cleaned up ash, and smiled to myself. They thought they'd broken me by burning down my barn, but all they'd done was clear the ground for something much bigger. I wasn't just going to rebuild. I was going to flip the whole script, and if Karen thought she'd had a bad day dealing with my goats, she was about to experience what happens when the quiet farmer decides he's done playing nice. They thought the barn was the heart of my land, but they didn't understand. The heart was still beating, and it was angry. A week after the fire, the air still smelled of soot and old wood. I'd gotten used to the emptiness where the barn once stood, but every time I looked at the blackened patch of land, something inside me smoldered too. The goats had adjusted faster than I had. They kept wandering over to sniff the ashes, looking confused. I'd started sleeping with the lights on outside, the cameras humming quietly in the night, capturing everything that moved. And I mean everything. Coyotes, raccoons, Karen's cat, and most interestingly, people. The first night, I caught 2 HOA board members walking around my pasture fence. They weren't just strolling by. One had a flashlight. The other had a clipboard. A clipboard at midnight. They weren't even subtle about it. The next morning, I found fresh boot prints in the soft dirt near the fence where my feed gate used to be. The only reason I didn't confront them was because I wanted to see how far they'd go. Sometimes you catch more fools by just letting them think you're still broken. Then came the footage that changed everything. It was on the 4th night after the fire, just past 2:00 in the morning. My motion sensor alert pinged while I was reading through some zoning documents Jackson had sent me. I opened the feed expecting maybe a deer or one of the goats escaping the paddock again. Instead, I saw a man, tall, wearing a hoodie and jeans, walking directly into my tool shed. The camera inside the shed caught the full view. He rummaged through boxes, checked drawers, and pulled out a folder labeled Property Docs. Then he turned, holding a half-empty gas can in one hand. He sat it down, looked directly at the camera by accident, and muttered something about this being easier if I just sold the damn place. Then he lit a cigar. I paused the video and zoomed in on his face. It was Karen's husband, Mark, the same man who once told me at a community barbecue that he respected the history of my land. I guess that respect burned up faster than the barn. I made 4 copies of the video, one for myself, one for my lawyer, one for the fire marshal, and one I saved just in case Karen tried to act surprised later. The next morning, I called in a favor from Steve down at the station. We'd gone to school together, and he was now a deputy with enough rank to actually do something. I showed him the footage, and his face went stiff. He said he'd open a report and loop in the fire department's investigator, but off the record, he told me not to expect a full takedown. Not yet. Karen had deep pockets and friends in local government. I'd need more than one smoking cigar to burn her down legally. That's when I decided to hit from another angle. Jackson had been helping me quietly check the ownership status of the HOA common lot, and he confirmed what we suspected. The land wasn't technically owned by the HOA. It was owned by a holding company formed during the early development phase. That company had defaulted on its taxes. If no one paid the back dues in the next 6 weeks, it would go to public auction. And public meant anyone could buy it. Karen and her crew were so busy harassing me and micromanaging everyone's lawn edges that they didn't even realize their precious HOA lot was about to disappear from under them. It was like watching someone build a glass mansion without noticing the termites in the foundation. I asked Jackson to help me prep the paperwork to bid anonymously. We'd make the move just before the deadline. Quiet, legal, irreversible. Meanwhile, I kept watching the cameras, turned up more gems. One night, Karen herself came around. She didn't go into the shed, but she did pace around the remains of the barn, talking on her phone. She said things like, "He'll break soon, and we'll just wait until he's tired of this mess." At one point, she kicked a piece of scorched wood and muttered something about eyes. I clipped the audio just in case. Then came the break-in blunder. 3 days later, Mark returned. This time he brought gloves. I guess he'd realized he left fingerprints the first time. Unfortunately for him, he also brought his buddy Gregory, another HOA board member who tripped over a feed bucket and fell face first into a camera. I almost felt bad. Almost. They left empty-handed, but not before Mark accidentally dropped his wallet outside the tool shed. Inside was his ID, a rewards card for some steakhouse, and a folded receipt for lighter fluid from the week before the fire. I nearly applauded. I gave the wallet to Steve at the station with a smile. No words, just the evidence. Steve raised his eyebrows and said things were about to get interesting. He didn't say it, but I could tell he was rooting for me. Half the county probably was. Meanwhile, the HOA doubled down. They sent more violation letters, this time for things like improper storage of construction debris. I guess they meant the ashes. Karen called in a noise complaint after I installed a generator. The inspector who came out looked embarrassed and said he was required to follow up, but admitted he didn't see any issue. He even gave Buster a treat. With every petty move they made, they pushed the community further into my corner. My neighbors, even the ones who had originally supported the HOA, started coming around more often. Some dropped off hay. Others offered help with rebuilding. One brought me a basket of muffins and said she was ashamed for voting for Karen. It was almost poetic. The more that HOA tried to break me, the stronger my support grew. And all the while, the auction deadline ticked closer. I had the funds ready. Jackson had the shell account registered. I'd already picked out the new paint color for the HOA pavilion, barn red, just for symbolism. The only thing left was patience. I kept a low profile, fed my goats, kept my cameras running, and played the long game. Every move Karen made gave me another reason to smile. Every desperate fine, every flailing violation letter, every whisper of complaint just showed how rattled they were. They thought I was just a farmer, but what they didn't realize was that farmers know the value of patience. We wait, we plan, we plant, and then, one day, we harvest everything. The county auction was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. on a Wednesday, the kind of morning most folks spent sipping coffee and arguing about weather patterns. But I was up at dawn, dressed like any other day, feeding the goats and humming an old country tune while trying not to think too far ahead. My plan was simple. Bid through the shell company Jackson helped me set up, win the auction, and wait, not act, not gloat. Just wait for Karen to find out the hard way that she didn't control everything she thought she did. Timing was everything. Let the rope out just long enough for her to hang herself with it. Jackson met me at the courthouse steps wearing a beat-up hat and an expression that couldn't hide how amused he was by the whole thing. We didn't talk much as we walked into the small auction room, just nodded to the clerk and found 2 empty chairs near the back. A few other bidders trickled in, none of them from around here. Out-of-town developers mostly, the kind that liked flipping public lots into gas stations or RV parks. I could see the annoyance on their faces when they realized the HOA parcel wasn't a gold mine. No plumbing, no utilities, just a community pavilion and a bunch of confused squirrels. The auction was over in 15 minutes. No one else even raised their hand when Jackson made the opening bid through the company. One guy checked his phone and left. Another tried to whisper something to his partner and gave up when he realized the back taxes weren't worth the headache. And just like that, it was done. I walked out the new owner of the HOA's beating heart, the land where they held their meetings, events, barbecues, and fundraisers. All mine now. Legally, quietly, completely. We didn't celebrate. Not yet. Jackson handed me the paperwork and said, "Now comes the fun part." I knew what he meant. The moment Karen found out, it would be like throwing a hornet's nest into her porcelain tea room. But I didn't plan to tell her right away. No, I wanted to make the most of her ignorance. Let her throw a few more tantrums. Let her sign off on plans for an upcoming HOA event on a piece of land she no longer had access to. Let her feel in control just a little longer. In the meantime, I started working on the goats' new home. The barn they'd lost had taken a toll on them too. They needed shelter, space, and something familiar. I figured, why not let them settle somewhere special? The HOA lot wasn't huge, but it had room enough for a few paddocks, a storage shed, and a bit of fencing. More importantly, it had visibility, the kind of place folks could stop by, bring their kids, maybe even do some goat yoga if they were into that sort of thing. At first, it started as a joke, but the idea stuck with me. A goat sanctuary right on the very land Karen had used to throw her HOA banquets. I kept things subtle. No signs. No big movement. Just a few panels of fencing delivered one morning. A portable shelter delivered the next. Then came the goats, trotting in like they owned the place. I brought Buster in first. He sniffed every corner like he was inspecting a hotel room, then plopped down under the old shade tree behind the pavilion. The others followed, nibbling at the grass, completely unaware of the irony. I sat on the old bench out front and imagined the next HOA meeting with Karen standing up at the podium, trying to talk over the sound of bleating goats. The real fun started when the painters arrived. I hired them from a town 2 hours away to make sure word didn't get back too fast. They worked fast, stripping the dull gray paint from the pavilion and replacing it with a vibrant barn red, fresh and bold against the blue sky. I added a handmade wooden sign to the front porch that simply read Goat Sanctuary, Public Welcome in white block letters. I didn't even need to say who owned it. Anyone with a brain would know. The first reaction came that weekend. I was sitting under the tree with a cup of lemonade when I saw Karen's silver SUV screech to a halt at the edge of the gravel lot. She stepped out, mouth already open, staring at the goats like she'd wandered into some bizarre dream. Her heels sank into the dirt as she stomped across the grass. I stood up and greeted her with a smile, like I'd just bumped into an old friend at the grocery store. She didn't return it. "What is this?" she demanded, motioning wildly to the goats. The red building, the sign. I told her the land had gone up for auction, and a new owner had moved in. Real animal lover, I added. Karen's face shifted like she was doing math in her head, and the numbers weren't making sense. She pulled out her phone, started dialing, probably one of the other board members. I watched her pace back and forth, yelling into the phone, then pausing to glare at the goats like they were personally responsible for her misery. I didn't say much else, just handed her a copy of the auction notice and proof of purchase with my name circled at the bottom. She stared at it for a long moment, like if she blinked hard enough, the letters would change. When they didn't, she threw it to the ground and stormed off. One of the goats trotted over and started chewing on the corner of the paper. I let him. Over the next few days, the story started to spread. The HOA board scrambled to explain what had happened, but the truth couldn't be buried. Neighbors started showing up out of curiosity, bringing their kids to see the goats, taking pictures by the sign. One even asked if I'd host birthday parties. I hadn't even thought that far ahead, but I nodded and said, sure, why not? The place was already becoming something better than it had ever been under Karen's control. Karen tried to fight back. She posted angry notes on the community board, accusing me of sabotage, of trickery, of undermining the HOA's sacred space, but no one seemed to care. If anything, more people started stopping by. Some even thanked me for finally giving the neighborhood something to smile about. Every time Karen drove by, her face twisted a little tighter, her eyes a little wider, her voice a little louder. She couldn't stand the fact that I hadn't just survived the fire. I'd turned the ashes into something better, something visible, and worst of all for her, something that brought people together without needing a single FOA approval form. I didn't say a word. I just kept painting fences, feeding goats, and watching everything unfold exactly how I wanted. They had taken my barn, but I had taken their foundation. And the best part was, the storm hadn't even started yet. Karen wasted no time calling an emergency HOA meeting, but the irony was she no longer had a place to host it. Her beloved community pavilion now belonged to me, and she was forced to move the gathering to her driveway under a pop-up canopy next to her rose bushes. I watched from my porch, sipping sweet tea as neighbors trickled in with confused faces and folding chairs. They looked uncomfortable, like they could feel something was off but couldn't quite say it. Karen stood there in her white blouse and oversized sunglasses, barking into a megaphone like she was leading a protest instead of a homeowner meeting. She ranted about goats, trespassers, property theft, and how I had illegally taken over the HOA lot. She made it sound like I had stormed the gates in the dead of night and planted a flag in the soil, but most of the neighbors had already seen the paperwork posted on the sanctuary gate. The truth was spreading faster than her paranoia. She tried to file a cease and desist letter through the HOA lawyer, but the letter had no weight. The land was legally mine. The goats were legally housed. The building, the fence, the pavilion, all transferred fair and square. Her attempt at intimidation was nothing more than a strongly worded tantrum on letterhead. Still, she tried. She had the letter hand-delivered to my porch by a teenage boy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I read it, chuckled, and sent him back with a fresh loaf of banana bread and a thank you note that said, "Tell your mom not to worry. We're just getting started." That's when she made her next mistake. She sued me. Officially. She filed a lawsuit claiming I had used insider knowledge and deceptive tactics to acquire the property. Her husband, Mark, signed the affidavit as a witness. This was the same man I had on camera breaking into my shed and handling a gas can while mumbling threats. My lawyer nearly fell out of his chair laughing when he read through the court document. He said if this went to trial, it would be one of the easiest cases he'd ever defended. We filed a countersuit the same week. Arson, trespassing, property damage, attempted intimidation, and because we had video footage, receipts, and witness statements, the case wasn't just strong, it was airtight. The court date was set for 2 months later, but Karen's world began to crumble almost immediately. One of the local reporters got wind of the lawsuit and started digging. A small piece ran in the community newsletter about the sanctuary dispute, but it snowballed into a local news story once they uncovered the fire report and the sheriff's visit. The article quoted a source close to the investigation, Steve, who confirmed that a certain HOA board member was being looked at for potential involvement in the barn fire. The story included a blurry still frame from my trail cam of Mark holding the gas can. That was enough. The internet did the rest. Within hours, Karen was a meme. Someone dubbed her the Goat Grinch. Another person took a screenshot of her yelling at the sanctuary fence and added cartoon steam coming out of her ears. A local radio host invited me on the air to talk about the sanctuary and what it was like turning HOA property into a public haven. I accepted, not because I wanted the attention, but because it would only pour more salt into Karen's wounds. I showed up in overalls with a photo of Buster and told the host the real heroes were the goats. The segment went viral. I didn't even know what going viral felt like until my niece texted me a video clip of Karen slipping in goat poop with over 100,000 views and a sound remix playing behind it. Back in the neighborhood, the rest of the HOA board started jumping ship. Gregory resigned first, citing personal stress. Then Janice stepped down after claiming the HOA had lost its sense of direction. I figured direction wasn't the problem. It was the destination. They'd hitched their wagon to Karen, and now that wagon was in flames. With half the board gone, the HOA couldn't function properly. No meetings, no votes, no enforcement. Karen tried to keep things going solo, but no one respected her authority anymore. One neighbor mowed his lawn at 2 o'clock in the morning just to spite her. Another painted his mailbox rainbow colors. When she tried to find them, they laughed. Karen must have sensed her grip slipping because she doubled down again. She filed noise complaints about the goats, claimed I was violating local animal ordinances, sent a city inspector out to my sanctuary with a stack of papers and a clipboard. The inspector arrived during one of our school tours. Minus 30 kids were sitting on hay bales while I told them about goat diets. When the inspector saw the scene, he didn't issue a violation. He asked if he could bring his daughter next week. He also bought 2 jars of goat milk lotion from the sanctuary shop and left a 5-star review on our website. Even with all that, Karen wasn't done. She came to the sanctuary one afternoon, standing just outside the fence line like a ghost of her former self. Her voice cracked as she demanded I take the sign down. Said it was an insult. Said it was a violation of the dignity of the community. I walked over slowly, rested my arms on the top of the fence, and told her I'd gladly take the sign down the day she admits who burned my barn. She didn't answer, just turned and walked away with stiff shoulders and clenched fists. I could see the fight was draining out of her. The fire she had lit had circled back around and consumed her own reputation, her power, her precious HOA. The day we walked into court, Karen wore all black again, like she was mourning something. Maybe she was. Maybe she realized somewhere deep down that the story she'd written for herself as the queen of the cul-de-sac was over. The judge barely let her lawyer speak before he brought up the footage, the receipts, and the surveillance timestamps. My lawyer laid everything out in calm, brutal detail. Karen's husband slumped lower and lower in his seat until finally, the judge paused and asked if the plaintiff wanted to amend their claim. Karen refused. She stood up and tried to explain, said she'd been provoked, said I had manipulated the system. That's when the judge stopped her mid-sentence and advised her to remain silent or risk further charges. In the end, the court dismissed her lawsuit entirely and opened a formal investigation into the fire. Karen didn't get fined that day. She got something worse. She got watched. Every move scrutinized. Every action documented. Her neighbors stopped making eye contact with her. Parents pulled their kids away when she walked by. The one who used to demand respect now couldn't even get a polite nod at the grocery store. I didn't celebrate that night. I just walked back to the sanctuary, sat on the bench with Buster next to me, and watched the sun dip below the hills. The goats were calm, grazing in their new home, and I thought about the barn that once stood where ashes now lay. I'd lost something real, but I'd built something stronger, not just for me, for the whole town. And as Karen's empire turned to dust, mine had just started to rise. The morning after the court hearing, I walked across the sanctuary lot with a quiet sense of finality. The ground felt solid under my boots, the kind of solid that comes when you know no one can touch what you've built. The goats wandered freely, grazing under the trees and occasionally bumping their heads against the picnic benches I'd installed over the past week. A few neighbors strolled by the fence, waving as they passed. One older couple stopped to ask if the sanctuary hosted field trips. I told them yes, and their faces lit up like it was the best thing they'd heard in weeks. Karen might have thought she was destroying my future when she lit that match, but in reality, she set the stage for something far more permanent. Construction on the new barn started the following Monday. I'd hired a local crew made up of neighbors and friends who wanted to help, not because they owed me anything, but because they believed in what we were doing. The new design wasn't just functional. It was a statement. Larger, fire-resistant, solar-powered, and fully outfitted with rainwater collection barrels. It had a learning corner with displays on sustainable farming and a space for the local school to run nature programs. I didn't want it to just be a barn. I wanted it to be a symbol, something built from the ashes with intention, not revenge. Though if revenge came as a side benefit, I wouldn't complain. As the frame rose, so did interest from nearby communities. A small organic market contacted me to ask if they could set up a weekend stall. Then the town's event planner asked if we'd be open to hosting a fall festival. Word spread fast. Before long, the calendar was filling up. Goat yoga on Saturdays, school tours on Wednesdays, weekend storytelling sessions under the big tree with kids sitting cross-legged in the grass while I talked about growing up on this land. Even Buster had become a minor celebrity, his face plastered on T-shirts and little jars of goat milk soap we started selling in a tiny roadside stand. Every time I saw someone take a photo beside the sanctuary sign, I couldn't help but grin. Meanwhile, the HOA was unraveling at the seams. With half the board gone and Karen publicly disgraced, the structure started collapsing in on itself. The members who once barked about lawn heights and mailboxes suddenly had nothing left to enforce. No authority, no direction, no meeting space. Karen tried to host another HOA meeting in her driveway, but only 3 people showed up, and one of them brought a sandwich and refused to put down their phone. When Karen passed out flyers about forming a neighborhood restoration committee, most people tossed them in the recycling bin before they even made it inside the house. The sanctuary, on the other hand, was becoming the beating heart of the community. It was open, welcoming, and full of energy. I hosted a weekend market that pulled in families from 3 counties. Stalls lined the edge of the property, selling fresh bread, honey, soap, and vegetables. Local musicians played under the oak tree, while kids ran around with balloon animals and sticky hands. I even opened up the pavilion for birthday parties. Someone hung up streamers and left behind a thank you note that simply said, "Thank you for making this place feel like home again." Karen's attempts to regain control only grew more desperate. She called the city again, complaining about traffic from visitors. She tried reporting noise from the music, even though it only played in the afternoon. She sent an anonymous letter to the health department claiming the goats were unclean. The inspector arrived mid-morning and was greeted by neatly swept paths, a hand-washing station, and laminated care records for every animal. He walked around for 20 minutes, shook my hand, and left with a complimentary jar of lavender goat lotion. But the final straw came during one of the Sunday tours. I was showing a group of senior visitors around the new barn when someone pointed out a woman lurking near the fence. It was Karen. She was pacing along the edge of the sanctuary with a notebook in hand, scribbling like she was building a legal case based on goat hoofprints. I walked over and asked if she needed help. She said nothing, just narrowed her eyes, then turned and marched off. I watched her leave, wondering how long it would take her to realize there was nothing left to control. That evening, I got a call from one of the former board members. He was fed up, said the HOA had turned into a joke. He asked if I'd be interested in buying his property. I nearly dropped the phone. When I asked why, he said he wanted out of Karen's shadow, and there was no one else he trusted to respect the land. He wasn't the only one. Within 2 weeks, I had 3 offers from nearby homeowners. All of them wanted to sell. All of them wanted to stay in the area, just not under the HOA's thumb. I didn't buy all of them. I wasn't trying to take over the neighborhood, but I did buy the house directly next to Karen's. I turned it into a guest house for visitors to the sanctuary, painted it a cheerful yellow with white trim, and added a sign out front that read, "Welcome, friends." Karen watched from her porch the entire time the painters worked, arms crossed so tightly she looked like a statue. She didn't say a word, but her glare could have cut glass. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who once tried to force me out now had to wake up every morning to the sight of goat yoga mats drying on a fence and cheerful families walking by with paper cups of lemonade. And she couldn't stop it. She couldn't find it. She couldn't control it. The land she wanted to erase had become the thing everyone admired most. Sometimes I still caught her outside, peering through her blinds or standing on her porch with that same sour expression. I never waved. I never spoke. I didn't need to. The sanctuary spoke for itself. The laughter, the music, the smell of fresh grass and feed, the goats trotting across the field like little ambassadors of peace. All of it said the same thing loud and clear. You tried to bury me, but you forgot I was a seed. And now that seed had grown into something bigger than either of us could have imagined. Fall settled in like a slow-burning sunset across the sanctuary, coloring the trees with golden leaves and drawing in cooler winds that made the goats a little friskier in the mornings. The air was crisp, the grass still green, and the smell of hay and cider drifted over the fence as the final preparations for the first ever goat gala were underway. What started as a joke between me and a neighbor had turned into something much bigger. It wasn't just a celebration anymore. It had become a symbol. An unspoken victory march for the people who had watched the neighborhood transform from a battleground into something joyful and free. I spent the week stringing up lanterns around the property, setting out bales of straw for seating, and helping the volunteers hang colorful banners that read "Goat Gala" across the new barn. Kids painted signs for the games while vendors set up booths filled with homemade pies, jams, and hand-knitted scarves. We brought in a bluegrass band and arranged a little stage in front of the old oak tree. Even the goats had special roles. A few of the friendlier ones wore little bandanas and posed for pictures. Buster, as always, stole the show by eating half the decorations before the event even started. Word had spread so fast that people from other counties showed up. Cars lined the country road, and families poured in with their lawn chairs, smiling like they hadn't had a reason to smile in months. I walked around, greeting everyone, making sure the ciders stayed warm and the marshmallows for the fire pit were stocked. At one point, I looked around and realized the entire sanctuary was full of life. Laughter echoed under the trees. Music drifted in the air. Children ran between goats and hay bales like it was the most natural thing in the world. For a moment, it didn't feel like I was standing on what used to be a war zone. It felt like peace. That peace was broken just a little after sunset when someone pointed toward the road and whispered, "She's here." I turned my head and saw Karen standing by the fence. She wasn't dressed like she used to be. No flashy jewelry or polished heels. She wore a heavy black coat, her hair pulled tight, her eyes scanning the crowd like she was trying to find a reason to protest but couldn't find her footing. I watched her take a few steps forward before stopping near the sign that welcomed everyone to the gala. She just stood there staring. No clipboard. No phone. Just her alone, while the music played and people danced. She didn't step onto the property. Not at first. But an hour later, she reappeared near the back gate. One of the volunteers said she had asked if she could come in. That surprised me. The Karen I knew wouldn't ask. She'd demand. I gave a small nod and said, "If she's willing to walk in like everybody else, let her." And so she did. Slowly. Cautiously. She passed through the gate, keeping to the shadows like someone who didn't belong at a party they once tried to shut down. She didn't talk to anyone, just walked along the edge of the event, passing the booths, the games, the sanctuary walls now glowing with lantern light. I saw her pause near the mural one of the local artists had painted on the barn. It showed the story of the fire, the rebirth, and the community that came together after the ashes. At the center of it was a goat wearing a crown of flowers, standing in front of the red barn like a guardian. Karen stared at it a long while. Then she turned and walked toward the fence line where the goats were resting under a heat lamp. Buster looked up, blinked, and then promptly ignored her. What happened next? No one expected. Karen stepped too close to the fencing and slipped in the soft dirt. She went down fast, her coat catching on the wire as she tumbled. A few people nearby gasped. One woman rushed over to help. Karen sat up, her hands muddy, her expression lost between anger and humiliation. A flashlight clicked on. Cameras lifted, and in seconds, someone was recording. I walked over quietly and offered my hand. She didn't take it, just stood on her own, brushed herself off, and muttered something about never coming back. Then she stormed off, her heels sinking in the ground with every step. She disappeared into the night without another word. The video hit social media before the gala ended. Another remix, this time with goat bleats sensed to her fall. I didn't laugh. Not publicly. I just shook my head and got back to work, refilling cider and thanking the last of the guests as they trickled out. The night ended peacefully. People hugged. Kids waved. A few folks even stayed behind to help clean up. By the time I sat down on the front porch with a mug of coffee in hand, the stars had taken over the sky, and the sanctuary had gone quiet again. The next morning, I woke up to a knock at the door. It was Steve, the deputy. He looked amused, said Karen had tried one last stunt during the night, claimed she had proof I was violating code by running a business without permits. But when she tried to sneak onto the property again to collect photos, she got caught on the new infrared motion cameras I'd installed the week before. Clear as day, her face lit up like a ghost in the red lens. Steve said she was issued a trespassing warning and advised to stay away from the sanctuary for good. She didn't argue this time. She just nodded, said nothing, and left. According to Steve, she looked tired. Not just physically, but tired in a way that seeps into your bones. Like someone who finally realized the war was over, and she lost. Not just the battle for control, but the battle for respect, for relevance, for connection. Later that week, I took a walk across the property, checking the fences and making notes for winter prep. Everything was in place. The barn was solid. The goats were thriving. The community had grown around the sanctuary like roots wrapping around stone. And somewhere behind all the laughter, the growth, and the quiet moments of healing, I realized something important. This was never just about revenge. It was about taking back something sacred, not just land, not just peace, but the right to live without fear of being bullied by those who think power is more important than kindness. Karen's last attempt to win had left her more isolated than ever, and in that silence, in that space she could no longer control, something far better had taken root, something she could never burn down. Winter came in slow and steady, brushing the sanctuary fields with frost and softening the ground underfoot. The leaves had long since fallen, and the trees stood bare like sentinels watching over the land that had survived more than just a season of fire. Morning started earlier now, my breath fogging the air as I moved through the quiet paddocks, scattering feed and checking water lines. The goats were fluffier in their winter coats, a little lazier in the cold, but content. Everything felt still, like the land was finally exhaling after holding tension in its chest for too long. Karen's house sat silent. The porch lights hadn't come on in weeks. No flyers appeared on doorsteps. No HOA bulletins landed in mailboxes. Her name faded from conversations, and her presence became a thing people spoke of like weather from a storm that had passed. No one missed the meetings. No one missed the drama. One day, I saw a moving truck in front of her house. She didn't wave. She didn't even look in my direction. By sunset, the truck was gone, and so was she. No goodbye. No message. Just an empty driveway and a closed chapter. A few days later, I stood on the hill overlooking the sanctuary, that spot where the old barn once stood, and thought about everything it had taken to get here, the fire, the threats, the fight, the silence that followed. There was a strange beauty to it, like watching an old scar and remembering the pain but realizing it no longer hurt. I walked back down the hill and into the new barn, warm with soft lighting and the quiet sound of hooves on straw. A group of school kids had painted a mural inside one of the sidewalls. It showed goats leaping over fences, sunshine on the horizon, and a little red barn with smoke rising behind it, transforming into vines and flowers. I added one more piece to the sanctuary that winter. I built a wooden frame using some of the old scorched beams I had saved from the original barn. Not many, just a few, blackened at the edges but still strong. I cleaned them up, sanded them smooth, and carved a plaque that read, "What they meant to destroy became a sanctuary." I hung it at the front entrance, just above the gate where visitors came in. Some people paused to read it. Others just smiled and walked through. But to me, it was the final word, a quiet truth carved in something they couldn't erase. Spring followed, as it always does, sudden and bright and loud with life. The goats started kidding again, and tiny legs stumbled through new grass like they owned the world. Families returned, bringing picnic blankets and folding chairs, watching their kids chase baby goats while sipping lemonade. A couple asked if they could hold their wedding at the sanctuary. I said yes. Another neighbor asked if we consider turning one of the barns into a community center. I said we'd think about it. The land was becoming more than a sanctuary. It was becoming a foundation, a gathering place, a reminder. I ran into Steve again at the local diner. He said the investigation into the fire had officially closed. Mark had taken a plea deal for trespassing and tampering. There wasn't enough to press for arson, but it didn't matter anymore. He'd moved out of town. Karen had relocated to a city on the other side of the state. No one heard from her. No one asked. The HOA officially dissolved 2 months after she left. The bylaws, the fines, the restrictions, all shredded and thrown out with the rest of the old paperwork. The neighborhood was free. That freedom brought out the best in people. Without fear hanging over them, neighbors planted wildflowers instead of fighting over hedge height. One man turned his front yard into a pollinator garden. Another built a small library stand on his lawn with books for kids and seniors alike. People started waving again, smiling more, laughing in the street instead of hiding behind hedges. A place that had once felt divided now felt like a real community. The goats became celebrities in their own right. Local schools asked to adopt them as mascots. The sanctuary got featured in a regional magazine. Buster got his own storybook, written by a second-grade class, complete with stick figure drawings and a title that read, "Buster Saves the Barn." I kept it on a shelf by the sanctuary office, right next to the original deed and a copy of the court ruling that gave me the land. I didn't do it all alone. The community helped. the friends who stood by me when the barn burned, the strangers who became neighbors, the kids who painted walls and fed goats and grew up knowing what it meant to stand your ground with kindness instead of cruelty. Together, we took something broken and built something honest. One evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned that soft orange that only happens at the start of summer, I sat on the front porch of the guest house and looked out across everything we'd made, the fences, the trees, the animals moving slowly through the pasture. It didn't feel like a win or a victory anymore. It felt like home. Not just mine. Everyone's. The land had always mattered, but now it meant something more. It was proof. Proof that the loudest person in the room doesn't always win, that money and power and threats can be overcome by patience and grit and quiet, steady truth. Proof that fire doesn't end a story. Sometimes it just clears the way for a better one. The last thing I did that night was walk down to the gate and lock it gently behind me. The plague caught the last of the sunlight, glowing just enough to catch my eye. I reached out and ran my hand across the carved words, the edges worn smooth by time and weather. Then I turned, took one last deep breath of that warm, clean air, and headed back up the path with Buster following close behind, his little hooves tapping out a rhythm I'd come to love. The sanctuary was quiet again. Not empty, just full in a different way, a kind of peace you don't get by accident.